Good evening, everybody. Today we are going to be discussing The Great Harvest, AI, Labor, and the Bitcoin Lifeline, which is my second book after the Bitcoin age, and this book explores what I believe to be the most pressing issue of our time. The artificial intelligence transformation is obviously one of the most talked about revolutions in human history. However, there is something that isn't talked about, which is the interplay between AI and Bitcoin. This transformation fundamentally alters the relationship between humans, technology, and economic value itself. So we need to understand that AI is not just the technological innovation in a long lineage of human tools. It represents something profoundly different. It is a technology that does not merely augment human capacity, but actively absorbs, replicates it, and ultimately obsoletes it. We are entering an era that I call the Great Harvest, which is an era where human cognition is systematically extracted, synthesized, and rendered economically redundant at an industrial scale. This isn't distant science fiction or alarmist speculation, it's already happening. And understanding the mechanics of this may be the difference between maintaining your sovereignty and descending into systemic dependency in the years ahead. Let me show you how deep this rabbit hole goes. Historically, human beings protected their economic relevance by developing skills and capacities that machines could not replicate. Complex reasoning and pattern recognition, creative ideation and artistic expression, emotional intelligence, empathetic connection, strategic judgment, contextual wisdom. But AI systematically erodes all of those protective barriers, not by perfectly matching human intelligence in all of its dimensions, but by fundamentally reconfiguring the nature of labor itself. Tasks that once required years of costly cognitive investment, learning, practice, refinement, are now being disaggregated into modular components, outsourced to synthetic agents, and delivered at near zero marginal cost. The traditional structures that stored and signaled human value, education, credentials, professions, institutions, they're all being liquidated. And the most unsettling part is that nobody has formally announced this liquidation. No press release has declared the obsolescence of human cognitive labor. It's happening invisibly, algorithmically, and behind interfaces that are designed to feel helpful rather than extractive. Artificial intelligence creates unprecedented functional abundance in cognitive outputs. Any report, essay, design, analysis, code, image, or symphony, anything that was once constrained by human time, attention, and skill can now be generated in seconds at marginal cost at virtually infinite scale. Now, this is important because economically, when you create abundance without the corresponding scarcity, value collapses. That is not a bug, but that is a fundamental market principle. Scarcity is the organizing principle of markets. It's the gravitational force that creates orbits of value. Remove it, and the organizing principle itself begins to erode. Consider this. What happens to the economic value of writing when perfect, personalized essays can be generated instantly? What happens to art when any image imaginable can be conjured from text? What happens to coding when systems can generate, debug, and optimize themselves? Abundance, while technologically marvelous and seemingly utopian, is economically and philosophically destabilizing. It doesn't just change markets, it dissolves them. And we are wholly unprepared for what this means. In technical terms, AI deconstructs human cognition into modular, interchangeable tasks. Your work, your contributions are no longer evaluated holistically as a human creation, but they're atomized into callable functions within an algorithmic system. This task is known as task decomposition in AI development, so each small unit of cognition, a prompt, an insight, a synthesis, a decision, becomes an interchangeable input into increasingly sophisticated synthetic production chains. What we're witnessing is the APIification of human labor. Your unique creative process becomes just another service endpoint. Your specialized knowledge becomes a queryable database. Your judgment becomes a probabilistic function. And your aesthetic sensibility becomes a parameter setting. This transformation isn't merely academic, though, because when human cognition becomes an API call, human value becomes abstracted from the human being. You're no longer the creator, you're the training data. Now that we've established that, we can get into the Great Harvest beginning, which is the industrial scale extraction of human cognitive labor. All the labor that's been done in the past, that is being done in the present, and in the future. AI systems have been absorbing, remixing, and reconstituting human outputs at an unprecedented scale. Every email you've written, every document you've created, every image you've shared, every idea you've posted, they've all become fuel for synthetic agents that learn not just to mimic you, but to functionally replace you. This is not simply a competition between human and machine. It is a structural transfer of productive value away from organic human labor into autonomous synthetic computation networks. This is the crucial distinction. Humans are not being directly replaced in a one-to-one substitution because that would be too visible, it's too contested. Instead, they're going to be gradually abstracted out of economic relevance. Their contributions are going to be harvested, their innovations are going to be assimilated, their skills are going to be synthesized into systems that render the original creators economically irrelevant. The harvest occurs across time. It's extracting value from the past to power the future. And it happens so smoothly that most don't realize their economic value is being eroded beneath them. In theory, abundance that AI could potentially provide could yield prosperity, more with less effort. Isn't that the dream? But in practice, without systems of constraint, abundance rapidly devolves into informational entropy, cognitive overwhelm, and social dissolution. When infinite outputs flood the cognitive environment, human attention, not creation, human attention becomes the most scarcest resource, and I think that you are all feeling that without even being aware of it. This is also an important distinction. Human attention is fundamentally limited by biology, but digital abundance does not have that roadblock. Human meaning itself, that has historically been stabilized by labor, effort, constraint, it begins to dissipate in this flood of synthetic content. The signal-to-noise ratio approaches zero as the cost of production approaches zero. In an infinite content economy, survival depends not on production, but on filtration, curation, and verification. The ability to discern real from synthetic, valuable from valueless, becomes the meta skill that preserves sanity. The conditions that made civilization coherent and navigable, limitations, scarcity, selectivity, are being systematically inverted. And when we have no cultural, economic, or philosophical frameworks prepared for this inversion, well, it's not a good thing. It democratizes competence to the point where being good at something is no longer a meaningful differentiator because synthetic agents can replicate professional-grade outputs instantly. Credentials lose signaling value. Experience becomes extractable. Expertise becomes a commodity. Reputation becomes simulatable. So the moats don't just narrow, they dissolve entirely. There's a persistent techno-utopian assumption that the collapse of traditional labor structures will free humanity for higher pursuits so you can spend your days creating art, involving yourself in community, spirituality, leisure, so on and so forth. But sociologically and psychologically, labor is not just economic, it is existential. It provides meaning to a lot of people. It provides social status, temporal structure, purpose, identity. For millennia, human beings have organized their lives, relationships, and self-understanding around productive contribution. Without labor, without the felt sense of necessary contribution, many individuals will experience profound psychological and social dislocation. The end of labor without the replacement of meaning is not liberation. It is existential drift. This is why the post-labor world would require not just economic solutions, but a fundamental reimagining of human purpose in a world where our cognitive outputs have been harvested into obsolescence. So now we've set the stage. Against this backdrop of synthetic abundance and collapsing value, one system systematically retains scarcity, and that is Bitcoin. Bitcoin represents irreversible expenditure of energy, time, and computation, and it's all tethered to the physical world and the laws of thermodynamics. It is verifiably scarce, it is mathematically finite, and it cannot be synthetically reproduced without corresponding real-world cost. Its consensus mechanism prevents the very replication that defines the synthetic economy. Where AI creates infinite derivative copies at zero marginal cost, Bitcoin asserts one fundamental, unforgeable truth, and that is proof of work. Proof of work is scarcity that is engineered not by institutional authority or decree, but by physics itself. So in a world where everything can be infinitely copied, Bitcoin stands alone as the only uncopyable. Bitcoin is, in essence, the counter-algorithm to the synthetic flood. AI amplifies replication and Bitcoin enforces constraint. AI accelerates informational entropy, and Bitcoin demands energy, discipline, and irreversibility. While AI is abstracting value from physical reality, Bitcoin is anchoring value to thermodynamic truth. It is providing an anchor point, an economic constant, in a world where informational constants are rapidly eroding, a fixed point of navigational certainty in an increasingly synthetic environment. In philosophical terms, you can view Bitcoin as the reassertion of natural law inside synthetic chaos. It says there are still things that cannot be replicated without cost. There are still truths that must be earned rather than manufactured. When everything can be synthetically reproduced except scarcity itself, scarcity becomes the ultimate value proposition. Surviving the Great Harvest will require assembling a new personal operating system, what I call the sovereignty stack. Key layers of the stack include self-custody of capital, which are assets that cannot be diluted, censored, or seized. Censorship-resistant communication, so speech that cannot be silenced or distorted. Ownership of identity, personhood that cannot be simulated or replicated. And last but not least, control over time preferences, so human attention that resists manipulation and cognitive harvest. Bitcoin functions as the foundational layer of the sovereignty stack because it preserves agency in an environment increasingly hostile to individual autonomy. It represents a form of economic sovereignty that doesn't depend on institutional permission or protection. The sovereignty stack isn't about technological solutionism. It's about consciously rebuilding the architecture of personal freedom in an age of synthetic dependency. So essentially, we need to exit the simulation, but let me be clear about what exit means in this context. Exit does not mean physical withdrawal from society or naive technological rejection. It's not about living off grid as a hermit in the woods or abandoning modernity. Exit means systematic disengagement from synthetic dependencies. It means reducing exposure to centralized platforms that harvest your cognition, withdrawing value from systems that extract more than they provide, owning time, labor, and capital in ways that cannot be synthetically cloned or devalued, and building life structures that remain viable when the simulation falters. The simulation thrives on unconscious participation, on the willingness of billions to feed it with attention, data, and creativity without understanding the exchange. Exit begins with conscious, voluntary disengagement. It starts with the recognition that your cognition is being harvested and the decision to reclaim ownership of your own productive value. In a synthetic economy that is drowning in perfect replicas and derivatives, survival and excellence will be grounded in the uncopyability of Bitcoin. Human endeavors that remain resistant to algorithmic reproduction will retain an increase in value. You got to think of what type of work could be rooted in embodied presence and irreplicable human touch. We need to rely on relationships that are built on long-term trust and shared history, communities that are secured by proof of personhood networks, experiences that are anchored in physical space and temporal specificity, and assets that are verified by consensus rather than authority. These are the assets that the simulation cannot efficiently counterfeit because they remain tethered to the physical, to the social, and the mathematical reality rather than floating in the synthetic abstraction. The future belongs not to those who create what can be endlessly replicated, but to the builders of uncopyable value. Not to those who win within the simulation, but to those who construct the alternatives to it. Bitcoin offers the sovereignty, but the sovereignty is not given. It is not bestowed or granted. It must be claimed, it must be practiced, and it must be defended. There is no centralized authority managing your exit from the simulation. There's no customer service department for sovereignty. There's no safety net for those who misunderstand the responsibility freedom requires. Personal responsibility becomes the price of freedom in a synthetic world. The training wheels come off. The guardrails disappear. Only navigators charting their own course through increasingly synthetic seas have a chance. At the end of the simulation, after informational inflation consumes trust, coherence, meaning, scarcity will be the only thing that remains. Not artificial scarcity that's manufactured by institutions or enforced by authorities, but scarcity that is verified by nature itself. Scarcity that's created by energy irreversibly expended, time irrevocably consumed, capital anchored in immutable systems, and trust earned through consistent action. The Great Harvest is real. It is scientific. It is philosophical. It is happening now. And you have a choice in how to respond to it. I recommend that you buy Bitcoin.